I'm Emily, 31 years old, and I never thought my younger brother, the kid I used to walk to school, would become the man who humiliated me in front of 200 guests. At his wedding, I smiled through everything. Until he took the mic, made a joke about my life, and everyone laughed. But what he didn't expect was that someone else had been watching. Someone who stood up with a truth so sharp, it cut the room silent. Before I tell you everything, tell me, where are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. I read every one. The air in my small duplex outside Denver always smells faintly of cinnamon and old books. It's a comfort, a scent that grounds me. I'm a part-time librarian, which means my days are filled with hushed whispers, the rustle of turning pages, and the quiet joy of connecting someone with the right story. My evenings are a different kind of story, a full-time mother to my 6-year-old son, Aaron. Our life isn't flashy. We live simply within our means. Lunchboxes are packed with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, budgets are kept tight, and my dresses, though carefully chosen, are always secondhand. There's a quiet dignity in it, I think. A resilience forged from necessity and love. When the wedding invitation arrived, thick and cream-colored, bearing Evan's elegant script, a tiny spark of hope ignited within me. He was getting married. My little brother. And he wanted me there. Maybe, just maybe, the ice that had formed between us over the years was finally thawing. Maybe I was still part of the family after all. I remember holding the invitation, tracing the embossed letters, a smile spreading across my face that felt both fragile and fiercely hopeful. Aaron, with his bright eyes and endless questions, was thrilled at the prospect of a wedding. We talked about it for weeks. He pictured himself as a knight, protecting his mom. I imagined a reunion, a quiet reconciliation, a sense of belonging that had been missing for so long. I bought him a little suit, a miniature version of what I imagined a superhero might wear to a formal event. He preened in front of the mirror, adjusting his tiny bow tie with serious concentration. "We belong here too, Mama," I told him, as much to convince myself as to reassure him. We were an island, Aaron and I, and for one hopeful moment, it felt like the mainland was extending a bridge. Our life before the storm was a mosaic of these small, ordinary moments, imbued with a deep, almost sacred comfort. Mornings began with the clatter of Aaron's cereal bowl and the low hum of the coffee maker. I'd butter his toast just the way he liked it, cut into triangles, while he recounted the vivid, fantastical narratives of his dreams. We'd walk to school, his small hand tucked firmly in mine, his endless chatter about superheroes and dinosaurs filling the quiet suburban streets. The crisp Colorado air, the scent of pine needles, the distant sound of traffic, these were the unremarkable details that formed the bedrock of our existence. Evenings were sacred. We'd make dinner together, or rather, he'd help, stirring the pasta with exaggerated care or setting the table with mismatched placemats he'd colored himself. The kitchen would be bathed in the soft glow of the overhead light, the aroma of garlic and tomato filling the space. We'd eat at our small, round kitchen table, sharing stories of our day. He'd tell me about the antics of his classmates, his voice animated and full of wonder. I'd listen, truly listen, feeling the warmth of his presence, the simple joy of our shared routine. These were the moments I cherished, the quiet rhythm of our lives that felt so profoundly right. We'd read before bed, curled up on his twin bed, the flashlight beam illuminating the pages of a well-loved storybook. His sleepy sighs, the gentle weight of his head on my shoulder, the faint scent of his shampoo, these were the anchor points of my universe. Sometimes, I'd sit on the porch swing after he was asleep, watching the streetlights cast long shadows, listening to the crickets chirp. The silence wasn't empty, it was full of the day's gentle echoes, a peaceful hum that spoke of safety and belonging. I'd think about Evan then, about our childhood, about how much had changed, but never with bitterness, always with a quiet longing for the way things used to be. Our life might have been small, but it was full, rich with the kind of love that weaves itself into the fabric of everyday existence. We built our own traditions, our own rituals, small acts of love that formed a fortress against the unspoken judgments that sometimes lingered in the periphery of my mind. These were the moments that painted the picture of our normal, the canvas against which the stark reality of what was to come would be brutally splashed. This sense of familiarity, of hard-won peace, was what I carried with me, what I thought I was bringing to Evan's celebration. A shared history, a quiet hope, a deep, deep sense of what could be lost. The first crack in the seemingly perfect facade wasn't a sudden shatter, but a hairline fracture, almost imperceptible. It began subtly, an unsettling feeling that crept in at the edges of my awareness. There was the text message from Evan weeks before the wedding, seemingly innocuous. I'd asked about the best time to arrive, to help with any last-minute preparations. His reply, just show up whenever, Emily. No big deal. It was the no big deal that resonated, a slight dismissal, a faint echo of the distance that had grown between us. It wasn't overtly rude, but it lacked the warmth, the casual familiarity I longed for. It was an indication, I realized later, that I wasn't truly needed, just tolerated. Then there was the conversation with my mother a few days before the event. She was usually meticulous about family updates, but when I asked about Evan's fiancée, Sarah, my mother's voice became clipped, almost evasive. Oh, she's lovely, dear. Very accomplished. The word accomplished hung in the air, weighted with unspoken comparisons. It wasn't said directly, but the implication was clear. Sarah was everything I wasn't. Successful. Married. Without a child outside the traditional structure. I felt a prickle of unease. It was the same subtle condescension I'd felt ever since Aaron was born, a soft, polite judgment disguised as concern. My mother changed the subject quickly, asking about Aaron's latest school project, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Was I still the family's cautionary tale, even at my brother's wedding? At the rehearsal dinner, I tried to brush off the feeling. I wore a dress I'd saved for, a deep emerald green that I thought brought out my eyes. I wanted to look my best, to show them I was doing well, that I was happy. But the small slights continued. Evan was busy, of course, the groom, but when I approached him, he gave me a quick, almost perfunctory hug before turning back to a group of his college friends, his laughter loud and easy. He didn't introduce me. It was as if I was just another guest, not his sister. Later, I overheard him talking to his fiancée's aunt, describing his family. He spoke of our parents, of his success, of Sarah's impeccable family. My name was noticeably absent. He listed his accomplishments, his future plans, his proud ascent, and I felt myself shrinking, becoming invisible in the grand narrative of his life. The strangest interaction was with Caleb, Evan's best man. He caught my eye across the room, a brief, almost imperceptible nod. He had a quiet intensity about him, a way of observing without intruding. Later, he approached me while I was getting a glass of water. Emily, he said, his voice low, it's good to see you. There was a genuine warmth in his tone that surprised me. We talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular, the weather, the venue. But his eyes, I noticed, kept drifting towards Evan, a flicker of something I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't animosity, but something akin to concern, perhaps a hint of disappointment. It made me wonder what he knew, what he saw that I didn't. He didn't say anything concrete, didn't hint at any specific issue, but the look in his eyes, the almost imperceptible pause before he spoke, left me with a lingering sense of disquiet. It was like a faint tremor before an earthquake, a subtle shift in the air that suggests something larger is coming. The calm before the storm wasn't truly calm, it was a deceptive stillness, filled with the growing hum of unspoken anxieties. Each fleeting glance, each carefully chosen word, each casual omission was a thread in the web of unease, slowly, meticulously being woven around me. The knot in my stomach tightened with each passing hour, a silent premonition of the storm gathering just beyond the horizon of my hopeful expectations. The room was bathed in the soft glow of fairy lights and the murmur of contented chatter. The clinking of glasses, the hum of conversations, the faint strains of the string quartet, it was the perfect picture of celebration. I sat at a table near the back, Aaron asleep in my lap, his head heavy against my shoulder. I'd danced with him earlier, a slow, gentle sway, feeling his small hand grip my dress. I'd tried to lose myself in the joy of the moment, to convince myself that everything was fine, that I belonged. But the unease that had been building over the past few weeks was a persistent undercurrent, a low thrum beneath the surface of the music and laughter. I watched Evan and Sarah on the dance floor, twirling, laughing, radiating happiness. A part of me genuinely felt joy for him, for the promise of their new life together. Another part, a quieter, more vulnerable part, felt a familiar ache of exclusion. Then the music died down. Evan, beaming, took the microphone. A ripple of anticipation went through the room. This was it, I thought. The groom's speech. He'd thank his parents, his new wife, his friends. Maybe, just maybe, he'd say something nice about me. A small acknowledgement of our shared history, of the years I'd spent trying to bridge the chasm between us. I held my breath, a tiny, foolish spark of hope still flickering within me. He started well, a charming anecdote about Sarah, a heartfelt thank you to his parents. My heart swelled a little, a familiar warmth spreading through my chest. Perhaps I had misjudged everything. Perhaps the distance was just a figment of my insecurity. Then he paused, a mischievous glint in his eye. He looked directly at my table, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. My stomach dropped. I knew that look. It was the look he used to have when he was about to tease me, back when we were kids, before the teasing turned sharp. And finally, he began, his voice amplified, carrying clearly across the silent room, a special thank you to my big sister, Emily, for being here tonight. A few polite claps. My smile felt frozen. He continued, his tone shifting, becoming lighter, more casual, almost confessional. You know, Emily has always been, well, she's always been a shining example of what not to do. The words hit me like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that stole my breath. It wasn't a joke, it was a declaration. The sound of laughter, initially tentative, then growing, sharp and undeniable, filled the room. Real, guttural, table-slapping laughter. It echoed in my ears, bouncing off the high ceilings, each peal a fresh stab. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a desperate flush of shame. My face was burning, but my body felt cold, numb. He kept going, oblivious to the quiet devastation unfolding at my table, or perhaps entirely aware and uncaring. I mean, raising a kid solo, working part-time, still renting, he paused for effect, letting the words hang in the air, letting the implications settle over the room like a suffocating blanket. Emily just shows us all that it's never too late to plateau. More laughter. Louder this time, bolder. It wasn't just a ripple, it was a wave, crashing over me, drowning me in public humiliation. Each word was a sharpened dagger, piercing through the fragile hope I'd harbored for so long. Plateau. The word reverberated in my mind, mocking me. It wasn't just a joke, it was a complete dismissal of my life, my struggles, my quiet triumphs. It was a public declaration of my perceived failure, delivered by the one person who, in my most vulnerable moments, I had always defended, always loved unconditionally. I felt the room tilt, the glittering lights blurring into abstract blurs. My vision narrowed. The faces around me, once indistinct, became sharply defined. My aunt, sipping champagne, a faint, indulgent smile on her face. My father, a low chuckle rumbling in his chest, his eyes fixed on Evan. My mother, pretending to check her phone, her gaze studiously avoiding mine. Not one person met my eyes. Not one person showed an ounce of discomfort. They were all complicit in their laughter, in their silence. They were all judging me, confirming everything Evan had just said. Aaron stirred in my lap, his small hand instinctively gripping my dress. He looked up, his eyes wide and innocent, filled with a child's unfiltered perception. He whispered, his voice small and uncertain, "Did Uncle mean that as a joke, Mama?" His question, so pure, so unburdened by the complexities of adult cruelty, was another blow. It exposed the raw wound, the gaping chasm between the world I tried to build for him and the harsh reality of the one I inhabited. I wanted to disappear. I wanted the earth to swallow me whole. I could taste the shame in my throat, acrid and metallic. It was a physical sensation, a burning tightness that made it hard to breathe. My own brother. In front of my son. The son he had dismissed, subtly and not so subtly, for years. How did I survive all these years, I thought, just to end up here again? Here, in this glittering room, surrounded by people who were supposed to be my family, feeling utterly, devastatingly alone. The betrayal wasn't just Evan's words, it was the silent complicity of everyone else, the way they normalized his cruelty with their laughter, their averted gazes. It was the crushing realization that the hope I had carried, the desire for reconciliation, was a naive delusion. This wasn't a family, it was an audience, and I was the punchline. The world I knew, the one I had painstakingly constructed, the one where love and loyalty were supposed to mean something, had just shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The quiet devastation settled over me, a heavy shroud. It wasn't a dramatic outburst, it was a stillness, a profound, internal collapse where every emotion was subsumed by a terrifying emptiness. Everything had changed. The silence that followed Caleb's words was a living thing, thick and suffocating. It wasn't a comfortable quiet, but a stunned, disbelieving hush. The laughter had died on people's lips, replaced by nervous coughs and averted gazes. I felt a strange sense of clarity, a sharp, almost disorienting focus in the midst of the chaos. My initial impulse, the one that had driven me for years, would have been to flee, to escape the searing spotlight of humiliation. But something was different this time. The quiet devastation, the internal collapse, had stripped away the layers of pretense, the desperate need to be accepted. What remained was a raw, resilient core. I didn't react with anger, not outwardly. There was no fire in my eyes, no trembling hands. Instead, a profound stillness settled over me, a quiet observation. I watched Evan's face, his carefully constructed composure crumbling under Caleb's unexpected truth. His jaw was tight, his eyes flickered, betraying a flicker of something akin to fear. He hadn't anticipated this. He had orchestrated his performance perfectly, but he hadn't accounted for an audience member who knew the script better than he did. And then I looked at Caleb. His stance was firm, his gaze steady, meeting Evan's without flinching. There was a quiet strength in him, a conviction that resonated deeply within me. He hadn't sought attention, he had simply spoken truth. His words, concise and powerful, had not only exposed Evan's cruelty, but had also, for the first time in years, acknowledged my own silent contributions, my sacrifices. He didn't grandstand, he simply laid out the facts, the unspoken history that had been conveniently erased from Evan's narrative. In that moment, a quiet realization bloomed within me. This wasn't about revenge, not in the petty sense of seeking to inflict pain for pain. This was about something far more fundamental, reclaiming my narrative. For too long, my story had been told for me, shaped by the convenient narratives of others, by their judgments and their dismissals. But Caleb's words had cracked open a window, letting in a shaft of light. He had shown me that not everyone was blind, not everyone was complicit. And that revelation was a powerful, quiet beginning. I looked at Aaron, still asleep in my arms, oblivious to the emotional earthquake that had just rocked the room. His innocence was a shield, but also a profound responsibility. I couldn't let him grow up believing that his mother was a plateau, what not to do. I had to show him what true strength looked like, the kind that didn't resort to public shaming, but stood tall in the face of it. Over the next few days, a different kind of planning began to unfold, not driven by rage, but by a quiet, strategic resolve. It started with introspection. I replayed the wedding, not just Evan's words, but the reactions of everyone in the room. The averted gazes, the nervous coughs, the way my parents had pretended not to notice. It wasn't just Evan, it was a systemic issue, a family culture that had normalized my marginalization. And in understanding the scope of the problem, I began to see the potential for change. I started a small, inconspicuous notebook. In it, I began to jot down everything I remembered. Not just the broad strokes, but the small, seemingly insignificant details that had accumulated over the years. The forgotten birthdays, the unanswered calls, the times I'd been excluded from family gatherings, the subtle digs veiled as jokes. I wasn't collecting evidence for a public trial. I was collecting it for myself, a tangible record of the quiet betrayals that had chipped away at my sense of worth. Each entry was a step in reclaiming my truth, a methodical cataloging of the unseen wounds. I also began to think about Caleb. His intervention had been unexpected, a true turning point. I didn't know him well, but his integrity resonated. I knew he lived in Denver too. A quiet thought formed, perhaps he could be an ally, someone who saw beyond the family's carefully constructed narrative. I wasn't sure how or when, but I knew I needed to understand what had motivated him. What had he seen? What did he know about Evan that I didn't? This period wasn't about seeking vengeance. It was about seeking justice, not in a legal sense, but in a spiritual one. It was about reestablishing balance, setting the record straight, not for the world, but for myself and for Aaron. I began to spend time researching online, quietly educating myself on the subtle art of strategic communication, of building a narrative that resonated with truth, not just emotion. I learned about the power of carefully placed words, of allowing others to draw their own conclusions based on undeniable facts. My quiet planning was not a plot for destruction, but a meticulous preparation for a new beginning. I was gathering my strength, not for a battle, but for a journey towards liberation, preparing myself for the next stage of reclaiming my life, one quiet, determined thought at a time. The shift from victim to agent of change wasn't a sudden leap. It was a slow, deliberate unfolding, a testament to the quiet power that blossoms in the aftermath of devastation. The shift wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible turning of the tide, like the slow, relentless erosion of a riverbank. It began with a conversation, a seemingly innocuous email exchange with Caleb a few weeks after the wedding. I thanked him for his words, for his courage. His reply was immediate, concise, and direct. It was time someone said something, Emily. Evan's always been like that. You just never saw it. That last sentence, you just never saw it, resonated deep within me. It wasn't accusatory, but a simple statement of fact. It implied a longer history, a pattern of behavior that I, in my unwavering loyalty and hope, had consistently overlooked or excused. It was the first crack in the foundation of my perceived reality of Evan, the brother I thought I knew. I asked if he'd be willing to meet for coffee. He agreed. We met at a small, unassuming cafe near the library where I worked. The scent of roasted beans and warm pastries filled the air, a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere of the wedding reception. Caleb was just as I remembered him, quiet, observant, his eyes missing nothing. He began by talking about college, about Evan's intense competitiveness, his need to always be the best, to always be seen as superior. He always saw you as a rival, Emily, Caleb said, stirring his coffee slowly. Not a sister. Not really. He needed to be the shining star, and anyone who outshone him, even inadvertently, became a threat. He then told me about a specific incident, something Evan had tried to keep buried. During their senior year of college, Evan had been vying for a prestigious internship. He was neck and neck with another student, a young woman named Clara. Evan, it turned out, had subtly sabotaged Clara's application, sending anonymous emails to the selection committee, casting doubt on her work ethic and reliability. He had carefully deleted all traces, but Caleb, who shared a computer with him in their dorm room, had stumbled upon a forgotten draft of one of the emails. He hadn't acted on it then, afraid of ruining Evan's future, but the incident had left a deep impression. He got the internship, of course, Caleb said, his voice flat. And Clara lost out. She never knew why. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just casual cruelty. This was calculated malice. It wasn't about being a shining example of what not to do. It was about Evan's deep-seated need to diminish others to elevate himself. It was a pattern, not an isolated incident. The veil lifted completely. The betrayal at the wedding wasn't just a moment of shame. It was a symptom of a much deeper, darker truth about my brother. Caleb then told me something else, something that shifted the balance of power decisively. He still had the draft email. He had kept it, a small digital artifact, tucked away on an old hard drive, a silent testament to Evan's true character. He said he couldn't stand by and watch Evan continue to hurt people, especially after what he'd done to me. "I think it's time everyone knew the real Evan," he said, his gaze meeting mine, unwavering. He wasn't suggesting an expose, not a public shaming on social media. His intent was far more precise. He offered to send the email to me, along with a few other carefully collected pieces of information he had stored over the years, small indications of Evan's manipulative tendencies. I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in a long time: control. Not vindictive control, but a quiet, empowering sense of agency. This wasn't about tearing Evan down. It was about revealing who he truly was, letting his own actions speak for themselves. The evidence wasn't for public consumption, not yet. It was for my parents. I knew my parents valued Evan's success above all else. They had always overlooked his flaws, excused his coldness, because he was the one who fit their ideal. But this was different. This wasn't about my life choices. This was about their son's character, his ethics, his fundamental decency. And this was something they couldn't ignore, not if the evidence was irrefutable. The next steps were taken with quiet precision. I crafted an email, carefully, meticulously. I attached the incriminating email from Caleb. I didn't accuse Evan directly. Instead, I simply laid out the facts, quoting Caleb's observation about Evan's need to be superior, then presenting the evidence of his past actions. I sent it to my parents, without a word of explanation beyond the attachments. I didn't call them, didn't try to influence their reaction. I simply let the truth speak for itself. The silence from them after that email was deafening. It stretched for days, each hour amplifying the tension. I knew the bomb had landed. I knew they were grappling with it. Evan, meanwhile, was oblivious. He had moved on from his wedding triumph, basking in the glow of his perceived perfection. He had no idea that the ground beneath him was quietly, irrevocably shifting. The quiet revenge was beginning to unfold, not with a bang, but with a silent, methodical unraveling. The sense of satisfaction wasn't triumphant. It was a profound sense of balance being restored, a quiet reclaiming of power that had been denied for too long. The unraveling began subtly, like the first loose thread in a meticulously woven tapestry. My parents called, not together, but separately. My mother first. Her voice was strained, brittle, lacking its usual performative cheer. She didn't apologize for Evan's words at the wedding, not directly. Instead, she asked, "Emily, where did you get that email?" Her question wasn't about the content, but the source, a desperate attempt to find a loophole, a way to dismiss the truth. I simply stated, calmly, it came from someone who knows Evan very well, someone who believes in speaking the truth. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. The information spoke for itself. There was a long silence on the line, punctuated only by her ragged breathing. "Your father, he's very upset," she finally whispered, almost to herself. And I knew then, truly knew, that the truth had finally landed. My father's call came the next day. His voice, usually booming with authority, was subdued, almost hoarse. He didn't ask about the email's origin. He simply said, "Emily, is this true?" About Clara. His question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of shattered illusions. I confirmed it, briefly, succinctly, without adding any emotion or commentary. I didn't need to twist the knife. The facts were doing that already. He sighed, a deep, shuddering sound that spoke of a profound disappointment. We always thought he was. We just thought he was so driven. The underlying implication was clear. They had mistaken ambition for integrity, ruthlessness for strength. The conversation ended quickly, leaving a hollow echo in its wake. There were no apologies, no grand gestures, but the shift was undeniable. The pedestal Evan had been placed upon, meticulously constructed by their pride, was crumbling. Evan's world began to unravel not with a sudden crash, but with a series of quiet tremors. First, there was the noticeable chill from our parents. They weren't outwardly hostile, but their usual effusive praise for his accomplishments had dried up. Conversations were shorter, their enthusiasm muted. Evan, so attuned to their approval, undoubtedly felt the shift. He called me, initially with irritation in his voice, demanding to know what I had done. "What did you tell them, Emily? They're acting weird." I simply replied, "I didn't tell them anything, Evan. I just showed them." His silence on the other end of the line was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. Then came the professional fallout. Caleb, I later learned, had quietly shared the story of Clara's sabotage with a few key figures in their shared professional network, people who valued integrity and fair play. Not an expose, but a subtle, strategic whisper. It wasn't a public shaming, it was simply the truth, subtly woven into the fabric of professional gossip. Soon, opportunities that seemed destined for Evan began to slip through his fingers. A promotion he had been vying for went to someone else. A coveted project was assigned to a less experienced colleague. The subtle rejections, the quiet exclusions, mirrored the very treatment he had inflicted upon me for years. He couldn't pinpoint the source, couldn't fight a phantom enemy. He only knew that the doors that had always opened effortlessly for him were now sticking, sometimes slamming shut. The social unraveling followed. Sarah, his new wife, was a woman who valued appearances above all else. When the subtle rumors began to circulate, when the quiet judgments from their social circle became more pronounced, her once radiant smile grew strained. Their public displays of affection became less frequent, replaced by strained silences and averted gazes at social gatherings. The perfect image they had curated for themselves was cracking, revealing the flaws beneath. For me, this period wasn't about reveling in his downfall. It was about healing. The absence of his oppressive shadow, the silence of his judgments, created a space for me to breathe, to truly exist for the first time in years. The shame I had carried, the feeling of being what not to do, began to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of validation. The healing wasn't a linear path. Some days, the echoes of his words still stung, a phantom pain in a limb that was no longer there. But most days I felt lighter, unburdened. I began to invest more deeply in my own life. I volunteered at Aaron's school, helping with their literacy program. I found a community there, a group of women who saw me not as a plateau, but as a dedicated mother, a compassionate person. We shared stories, laughter, and sometimes quiet tears. These were genuine connections, forged not on shared bloodlines or societal expectations, but on mutual respect and understanding. I started painting again, a hobby I had abandoned years ago, convinced I wasn't good enough. The canvas became a space for emotional release, a vibrant testament to the colors I was finally allowing back into my life. I signed up for an online course in creative writing, pouring my experiences, my observations, and my newfound strength into stories that were my own. Aaron thrived. He saw a different version of me now, one that was lighter, more present, less burdened by an unspoken sadness. We spent more time outdoors, hiking in the mountains, exploring the vast, open spaces of Colorado. He would run ahead, his laughter echoing through the trees, and I would watch him, a profound sense of peace settling over me. The process of reclaiming my peace was rooted in these simple acts: the quiet evenings spent reading with Aaron, the laughter with new friends, the brushstrokes on a canvas, the words on a page. It was about filling the void left by betrayal, not with bitterness, but with beauty, with purpose, with genuine connection. It was about understanding that true strength wasn't about never falling, but about rising, quietly and gracefully, after the shatter. The consequences of betrayal were evident, not just in Evan's unraveling world, but in the vibrant, flourishing world I was meticulously rebuilding for myself. The air in my duplex still smells of cinnamon and old books, but now there's an added fragrance. The faint scent of fresh paint from the canvas I work on in the evenings, a quiet declaration of new beginnings. I am Emily, 31 years old, and I am free. The chains of expectation, of family loyalty at all costs, of unspoken judgment, have finally fallen away. I am not the same person I was before the wedding, before the words, before the truth finally spoke. I am stronger, yes, but not in a hardened, unfeeling way. My strength is rooted in a quiet clarity, a profound understanding of who I am and what truly matters. I don't forgive Evan. Forgiveness, for me, would imply that what he did was a mistake, a momentary lapse, rather than a reflection of a deeper character flaw. It would be an erasure of my pain, a dismissal of the years I spent feeling small and unworthy. I don't hold on to the bitterness either. Bitterness is a poison, a self-inflicted wound that keeps you tethered to the past. I've chosen to cut that cord, to release myself from its grip. My peace isn't dependent on his acknowledgement or his repentance. It's an internal state, a hard-won victory of the spirit. I see Evan occasionally at family gatherings that are now less frequent and far more strained. The dynamic has irrevocably shifted. He is no longer the golden child, shielded by parental adoration. There's a quiet discomfort in their interactions, a tentative politeness that speaks volumes. My parents, too, are different. There's a new humility in their voices when they speak to me, a cautious respect that wasn't there before. They don't apologize, but their actions speak louder than words. They visit more often, take a genuine interest in Aaron's life, and for the first time, truly listen when I speak. It's not a full reconciliation, but it's a form of quiet repair, a recognition of past wrongs that they can't vocalize but can show. Aaron is thriving. He sees a mother who is confident, who is joyful, who pursues her passions. He knows what happened at the wedding, in a way a 6-year-old can understand betrayal. I explained it simply, without malice, focusing on the strength of truth and the importance of standing up for yourself. He saw me walk out of that reception with dignity, and that, I believe, taught him more than any words ever could. He knows his worth, unburdened by the echoes of another's insecurity. My resolution is not just of plot, but of self. I am no longer defined by the betrayal, but by my rise from it. I am no longer seeking external validation, but finding it within. My life is still quiet, still filled with everyday details, packing lunchboxes, reading stories, working at the library. But now, those details are imbued with a profound sense of purpose, a deep appreciation for the simple, unadorned beauty of my own existence. I have learned that the greatest strength lies not in never being hurt, but in rebuilding after the hurt, brick by quiet brick, into something stronger, more authentic, more resilient. The lingering question is not about what was lost, but about what was gained. Have you found your way back from betrayal? Have you reclaimed your truth?